Imagine walking down the street. Someone blindly bumps into you, spilling their coffee all over your clean shirt. And yet, before they can even speak, the words, "I'm so sorry," instinctively slip out of your own mouth. Why do some of us apologize for simply taking up space? Why is "I'm sorry" our default reaction to mistakes we didn't even make? You might have been told it's just politeness, or a sign of a deeply empathetic soul. But what if I told you that this reflex isn't about kindness at all? What if your chronic apologizing is actually a highly tuned survival mechanism, a silent, desperate alarm system wired into your brain years ago to protect you from a threat that might not even be there anymore? If you've ever found yourself apologizing to a piece of furniture you accidentally bumped into, this video is for you. Because the truth behind your over-apologizing is far heavier than just good manners. Let's uncover the hidden psychological script you've been forced to memorize. It is incredibly common to misunderstand chronic apologizers. Society often labels them as weak, excessively polite, or severely lacking in self-esteem. When we see someone constantly saying, "I'm sorry," for things completely out of their control, our first instinct is usually to offer a well-meaning but ultimately useless piece of advice. You really need to stop apologizing so much. We treat it like a simple bad habit, akin to biting one's nails, assuming they can just flip a conscious switch and turn it off. But here is the profound truth we often miss. Over-apologizing is rarely about genuine regret or a quirky, submissive personality trait. When someone apologizes for the weather being bad during your hangout or for asking a perfectly reasonable question at work, they aren't actually sorry. Instead, they are desperately trying to manage your emotional state. They are instinctively attempting to preempt any potential anger, disappointment, or conflict before it even has a chance to materialize. We love to romanticize this behavior as supreme empathy, praising these individuals for being so nice. But underneath that polite exterior lies an exhausting internal reality. They aren't just trying to be polite, they are trying to be safe. This isn't a personality flaw. It is a meticulously crafted coping mechanism. And to truly understand why a person would use the words, "I'm sorry," as an invisible, everyday shield, we have to turn the pages back. We need to look at the environments where they first learned that their emotional survival depended entirely on reading the room and keeping everyone else perfectly happy. To make sense of this relentless urge to apologize, we must look beyond etiquette and dive into the neuroscience of trauma. When faced with a threat, our autonomic nervous system activates survival protocols. Most are familiar with the classic fight or flight, and perhaps the freeze state. But there is a fourth, deeply misunderstood survival strategy, the fawn response. Coined by psychotherapist Pete Walker in his foundational work on complex PTSD, Walker, 2013, fawning is a trauma response where a person seeks safety by merging with the demands of others. They preemptively pacify a potential threat by becoming overly accommodating and, most notably, by taking the blame for things they didn't do. But why would a developing brain choose self-erasure over self-defense? The answer almost always lies in the environment where that brain was built. Imagine a childhood governed by unpredictability. Perhaps they grew up with a volatile parent whose moods shifted dangerously, or in a household where emotional validation was strictly conditional. In these environments, a child quickly learns that standing up for themselves or running away only escalates the danger. Instead, their brilliance as a survivor kicks in. They realize that if they can anticipate the anger, absorb the blame, and immediately apologize, they can de-escalate the situation. They become emotional lightning rods, taking the shock to keep the house from burning down. Over time, this childhood tactic hardwires itself into their adult neurology. The brain doesn't easily unlearn what kept it alive. So, when a coworker sighs heavily or a partner seems slightly distant, their amygdala sounds the same alarm bells it did 20 years ago. The chronic apology is a phantom reflex from a time when saying, "I'm sorry," was the only way to stay safe. The past has passed, but their nervous system is still trapped in survival mode. So, how exactly does this invisible trauma dictate the way they navigate their current reality? Let's explore the hidden mechanics of the chronic apologizer. This trauma response typically manifests in three profound, interconnected ways. First, we observe what can be called the preemptive strike. On the surface, this looks like extreme conscientiousness or politeness. Imagine sending a work email just 5 minutes later than promised. Instead of a simple, professional, "Here is the requested file," you attach a desperate 3-paragraph apology as if you have committed a severe corporate crime. The internal paradox here is striking. By trying to avoid conflict, you are actively painting a target on your own back, framing yourself as the guilty party before anyone else even registers a problem. You automatically assume the other person is already deeply disappointed in you. Scientifically, this isn't driven by actual guilt. It is a manifestation of anticipatory anxiety. You are punishing yourself first because a self-inflicted emotional wound feels infinitely safer than facing unpredictable criticism from another person. As highlighted in research on interpersonal emotion regulation and the psychology of apologies, Schumann, 2018, over-apologizers often possess a drastically lowered threshold for what constitutes an offense. They operate under the exhausting illusion that their mere existence is constantly violating social rules. So, ask yourself, if you are already the one holding the whip, how can anyone else hurt you? But this defensive tactic inevitably leads to a much heavier, invisible burden. This brings us to the second psychological pillar: hyper-responsibility syndrome. Chronic apologizers suffer from the agonizing delusion that they are the emotional thermostat of every room they enter. Picture a quiet dinner with a friend. If the friend is simply tired after a long day and stares blankly at the wall, the apologizer's brain immediately short-circuits into panic. Did I say something offensive? Am I being boring? I'm so sorry, I'm not good company tonight. They absorb any negative ambient energy and instinctively claim it as their own creation. Common wisdom suggests these people are incredibly empathetic. But clinical psychology reveals a darker truth. This is a form of emotional omnipotence, often born out of childhood trauma. If a child grows up in a volatile household, adopting the belief that "it's my fault my parents are angry" actually provides a bizarre sense of safety. Why? Because if the chaos is your fault, it means you have the power to fix it. Psychological frameworks, such as Tsiolkovsky's theory of inflated responsibility, Tsiolkovsky's 1996, explain how this cognitive distortion tricks the adult brain into carrying emotional weights that entirely belong to others. Why do you believe you are the sole architect of everyone else's mood? And what happens when this desperate illusion of control begins to chip away at your very soul? The final, and perhaps most devastating characteristic, is the erasure of the self. The fawning response demands a daily sacrifice, and that sacrifice is your authentic identity. Consider a mundane scenario. You go to a restaurant, the waiter brings you a well-done steak when you explicitly ordered chicken. Instead of politely correcting the error, you physically shrink, look down, and whisper, "I'm so sorry. I think I might have confused the order. I'll just eat this. It's fine. Sorry to bother you." You literally bend reality to accommodate someone else's mistake. You compress your desires and your boundaries into something so microscopically small it becomes invisible. Renowned trauma expert Dr. Gabor Mate, 2003, emphasizes that when individuals are forced to choose between attachment, staying connected to others, and authenticity, trauma survivors will tragically almost always sacrifice their authenticity. In that restaurant, you aren't just apologizing for a mixed-up meal. You are apologizing for having needs at all. Are you truly maintaining the peace, or are you just slowly deleting yourself from your own life? Shrinking yourself to appease the world might seem like a foolproof survival strategy, but the invoice for this invisible emotional labor eventually comes due. What happens when you spend your entire life buying peace at the expense of your own boundaries? The paradox of the chronic apologizer is that their ultimate weapon for conflict resolution eventually becomes the very thing that slowly destroys their relationships and their self-worth. First, we encounter the phenomenon of semantic satiation. When you apologize for the weather, for someone else stepping on your foot, and for simply existing in a space, the words "I'm sorry" completely lose their psychological weight. Because you hand out apologies like cheap flyers, when you actually make a genuine mistake that requires deep accountability, your apology rings hollow to those around you. You have accidentally cried wolf with your own contrition. But the most dangerous consequence lies in the type of people this behavior naturally attracts. If you are someone who instinctively takes the blame for everything, you become a perfect magnetic match for people who refuse to take the blame for anything. Chronic apologizers frequently find themselves trapped in the orbit of narcissists or highly manipulative individuals. The fawning response signals an absence of boundaries, broadcasting a silent, tragic message. You can project your toxic behavior onto me, and I will apologize for making you do it. Now, it is crucial to recognize that this trait isn't inherently bad. In genuinely dangerous or abusive situations, fawning is a brilliant, non-violent de-escalation tactic that literally saves lives. It kept you safe when you were vulnerable and small. But the tragic irony of the chronic apologizer is this. By continuing to use a wartime survival strategy in peacetime, you are inadvertently inviting the very emotional abuse you are so desperate to avoid. So, if the shield you built to protect yourself is now slowly suffocating you, how do you finally break this exhausting cycle and take your power back? So, where does this leave us? We have traced the chronic apology back to its hidden origins, not as a measure of extreme politeness, but as a profound trauma response, a fawning mechanism built to survive emotionally unpredictable environments. We have seen how this hyper-responsibility forces you to absorb the emotional weather of every room, and tragically, how it slowly erases your authentic self while attracting those who exploit your lack of boundaries. But recognizing this exhausting pattern is the first step toward reclaiming your space. You are no longer that vulnerable child who needed to absorb all the blame just to keep the peace. Perhaps the most profound apology you need to make right now is the one to yourself, for constantly shrinking your existence to make the rest of the world comfortable. As you step into tomorrow, I want to leave you with a question to reflect on. Whose voice are you actually hearing in your head when you instinctively apologize for a storm you didn't create? If this exploration resonated with your journey, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your experiences in the comments below. Until next time, remember that it is safe to take up space.